Switch my phone.
Phones off. One. Quite impressive.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon and good evening if you're following us remotely. Welcome to this press conference of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to present the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Let me introduce your panelists today, going from my left, right to you. So on my left, Valérie Masson-Delmotte, co-chair of Working Group 1, and Pan-Mal Jai, co-chair of Working Group 1. Working Group 1 deals with the physical science basis of climate change. Then on their left, Abdallah Moqsit, secretary of the IPCC, and Hui-Sung Lee, the chair of the IPCC. Then carrying on, Jim Ski and Priyadarshi Shukla, both co-chairs of Working Group 3, which deals with the mitigation of climate change, and then Hans Otto Pertner and Deborah Roberts, co-chairs of Working Group 2, dealing with the impacts and adaptation. Deborah is sitting at the end because she has to leave to catch a plane in about half an hour. If you're following this press conference remotely, you can also ask questions by going onto Slido, that's sli.do, putting in the event code SR15 and then hitting join. And you can submit questions remotely, up to 300 characters, and you must put your name and organization in, otherwise we can't take them. If you're following this in the room or outside and you're covering it on social media, please use the hashtag SR15. So I'm going to hand over now to the chair of the IPCC, Dr. Lee, who will give you an introduction to the report, and then the co-chairs will give you some information about the report and go through the highlights, and then we'll be very happy to take your questions. We've got about an hour and a half this morning. Thank you. So I'll hand over to the chair, Dr. Hui-Sung Lee.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning. I'm delighted to open this presentation to you of the IPCC's new special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. This is one of the most important reports ever produced by the IPCC, and certainly the most keenly awaited. When governments meeting in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, known as UNFCCC, adopted the Paris Agreement at the end of 2015, they invited the IPCC to prepare a report in 2018 on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and related emissions pathways. Why did they do that? The Paris Agreement sets a target of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit it to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. At that time, thanks to the IPCC's, our last assessment, which is the fifth assessment report, governments had a clear understanding of the implications of warming 2 degrees Celsius. But relatively little was known about 1.5 degrees, and the IPCC report and the scientific research it catalyzed was intended to fill that gap. Why 2018? Because at the Katowice Climate Change Convention in December this year, governments will review progress on the Paris Agreement in a process known as a Talanoa dialogue. It was extremely challenging to produce a cross-disciplinary work cross-disciplinary report on this subject in a relatively short time. This is the first time in IPCC's history all three working groups put their efforts together to produce this report. IPCC accepted the challenge, framing the report in the context of sustainable development and eradicating poverty. We have now delivered, after a Herculean effort by our authors and experts and our Bureau members. The culmination of this process was last week's approval session here in Incheon with representatives of our member governments, working with authors on the summary for policymakers to ensure it was a clear, faithful representation of the full report. It was an intense and passionate 6 days with many sleepless nights, but always collegial and always respectful. Governments teased out the essentials of the report in a spirit of compromise, drawing on the creativity of the authors. The result was a summary and a report approved and accepted by all our member governments. This report is a rich resource for governments formulating climate policy areas that are affected by climate change, and a key input into coming climate negotiations. My colleagues will share the key findings with you in a very short minute of time. Let me give you the highlights. First, climate change is already affecting people, ecosystems, and livelihoods all around the world. Second, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is not impossible, but will require unprecedented transitions in all aspects of society. Third, there are clear benefits to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees or higher. Every bit of warming matters. Lastly, the limiting warming to 1.5 degrees can go hand in hand with achieving other world goals, such as achieving sustainable development and eradicating poverty. With that, I would like to hand over to Valerie, the Working Group Co-Chair 1.
Thank you, Ho-Sung. Before we get on to presenting the findings of the special report on 1.5 degree global warming, I'm proud to unveil the draft cover page of this special report. An artist created the piece of visual art on this front cover, having been inspired by a scientific figure in the summary for policymakers. Perhaps you can recognize it. This is a very special report. It has attracted great interest from all around the world, which we can see reflected in some of the following key statistics. Our report is the outcome of the work of 91 dedicated lead authors and review editors from 40 countries, and the inputs of 133 contributing authors. And as part of the synthesis of new knowledge, the authors assessed more than 6,000 scientific publications. The successive drafts of the report received more than 42,000 comments from more than 1,000 experts and government reviewers worldwide. With that, I will now hand over to my fellow co-chair, Pan Mao Jai, to introduce the key findings of the report.
Thanks, Valerie. Today, we are presenting a summary of key findings from the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. You can find more detail in the summary of the policymakers and even more information in the underlying report. We begin with first section of SPM, understanding global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. We know that since pre-industrial times, human activity has caused approximately 1 degree Celsius of global warming, with likely range between 0.1 degrees C and 1.2 degrees C. We are already seeing the consequence of 1 degree C of global warming through more extreme weather, rising sea levels, and diminishing Arctic sea ice, among other changes. If the world continues to warm at the current rate, global temperature is likely to reach 1.5 degrees C between 2030 to 2052. Although past emission from the pre-industrial times to the present will continue to cause long-term changes in the climate system, this emission alone do not commit to the world of 1.5 degrees C. Thank you.
Moving on to the second section of the SPM, which deals with projected climate change, potential impacts, and associated risks. Models project robust differences in climate between present day and global warming of 1.5 degrees and between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. Every bit of extra warming makes a difference. These differences include increases in mean temperature on land and in the oceans, hot extremes where people live, heavy rainfall in several regions, and the probability of drought in some regions. By 2100, global mean sea level rise would be around 10 centimeters lower with global warming of 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. This would mean up to 10 million fewer people exposed to the risk of rising seas. Loss of biodiversity and species extinction are projected to be lower with global warming of 1.5 degrees compared to 2 degrees. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees would also mean smaller reductions in the yields of maize, rice, wheat, and potentially other cereal crops, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Central and South America. The proportion of the world population exposed to climate change-induced water shortages would be up to 50% less with global warming of 1.5 compared to 2 degrees. Importantly, this special report highlights how all of these things affect people's lives and livelihoods around the world. For example, the impacts of climate change in the oceans are increasing risks to fisheries and livelihoods that depend on them. Limiting global warming to 1.5 compared to 2 degrees would reduce the number of people exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred millions by 2050.
And now the third section of the SPM, which deals with emissions and system transitions consistent with 1.5C of global warming. Limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees implies reducing emissions of carbon dioxide by about 45% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. For comparison, in most pathways that limit global warming to below 2 degrees C, carbon dioxide emissions decline by about 20% by 2030. To limit global warming to 1.5 C, global emissions of carbon dioxide would need to reach net zero around 2050. This means that any remaining emissions would need to be balanced by removing carbon dioxide from the air. For comparison, pathways that limit global warming to 2 degrees C reach net zero around 2075. As part of limiting warming to 1.5 C, reducing emissions of substances other than carbon dioxide that affect the climate would improve air quality and have direct and immediate health benefits.
Okay, thank you, Shukla.